Thank you. Hello, everyone. Today I will talk about requirements engineering and my experiences with data projects. This is my first session I submitted as a speaker. Really honored all chose to hear me talking. English is not my native language, but I try hard and excuse in advance if some sentences are not complete.
Sorry, Margarita, can you try to get the mic a little more towards your mouth?
Better?
Much better.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. If you have some questions or remarks, there is a hands up button in Team. Feel free to use it. And I hope I can see it when I'm in the presentation mode. Just talk in there. I will start.
And maybe sorry again. I will also have a look at the chat and will collect some questions. And Margarita, whenever you will have a break and say if there are any questions, I will try and present the collected questions.
Okay, thank you. A quick introduction of myself. I'm Margarita Neumueller. I use the pronouns she, her, and made my experience in different projects in-house and as an external consultant. My main focus were data projects in the past, but I also had touching points with infrastructure and software projects. You can contact me via LinkedIn, Xing, and email afterwards if there is anything you want to discuss with me, or if any questions you think of later, or if you have feedback you might like to give me. Here a quick overview about the topics we will talk about in the next hour. We will talk about why we use requirements engineering, what exactly requirements engineering is. We will also talk a bit about the difference between Agile and waterfall, where the requirements engineering lies, and what's part of requirements engineering. I think the most exciting part is what tools you can use, because that's not only for requirements engineering, but definitely also for them. And at the end, I will talk a bit about the peculiarities of data projects and requirements engineering. And if you didn't get any questions in the meantime, at the end is also time to ask some questions. So why requirements engineering? Here you can see a picture. I think most of you already know, but maybe not everyone. But I like this picture because it shows really good why gathering requirements are hard and why it's also so important. It's all about communication and minimizing the risk that the programmer does picture 4 and not picture 5, what the customer really needs. So why requirements engineering? Because we want to define requirements. We want to maximize the chance that the customer needs are satisfied, because a happy customer will use the system in the end. An unhappy customer could defy the software or the system, and the system costs a lot of money and is wasted when it's not used. Also, not only from the perspective of a customer, but as an engineer, I know what to implement and in which order. Requirement has to be clear for the programmers too. Nothing so frustrating while engineering when you have to guess what to do or where to start. You just want to program the code and don't want to specify parallels from requirements because half of the informations were missing. Or want to program the same code again and again and again because the customer is always unhappy and has something to add on. So, what is our requirements engineering? Requirements engineering is the process of confirmation engineering designs to set a core software requirements. The main tasks are identifying, specifying, documentation, checking, and classification of requirements. In short, it's a structured and professionalized way of minimizing the risk of doing the wrong things. That's completely irrelevant if we're talking about infrastructure, software, data, or not IT project. in the big picture, that means a lot of talking and communicating with the stakeholders. But there's one big issue when talking with the stakeholders about requirements. Not the requirements we deserve, but the requirements we need. Or, as I learned early on from one of my bosses, customers don't know what they need. They just know what they want. And this doesn't have to be the same. When we are talking with customers or stakeholders about requirements, they often talk about solutions, not about problems. They read an article or heard from a colleague or know somebody that is already working with. The list goes on with reasons. But what we have to discuss with them are not the solutions, but the problems. Sometimes, not always, you have to ignore the wants to identify the needs first. One thing I would advise is always, really always ask why when somebody comes with a solution to you they want. Why do they want it? Why do they need it? Why is it important? You have to get behind the things stakeholders are telling you. You have to be a good listener and need empathy to read between the lines when somebody tells you something. And first, to be a requirements engineer sounds easy. Talk with the stakeholders, ask them what they want, and write it down. But it's not so easy. When you think there is the line, there's still a big chance that the customer will be unsatisfied with the end product because the requirements only scratch on the surface. All the projects I worked with were either waterfall or an Agile framework, mostly Scrum. And there's a tiny difference where requirements engineering is located. So just for a quick overview, a picture of the waterfall framework. And as you can see, the requirements and analysis block is in the first one. All other steps can't be done when the requirements aren't clear. So you just do your thing as a requirements engineer, gather all the requirements, and when you're done, the other gets up to their work. And maybe you're not even part of the project anymore. If there are changes in the requirements, it needs change requests. But this is typically not done by the requirements engineer, but by the project manager. In this picture, you see a simplified Scrum framework. It looks similar to the waterfall because the requirements engineering is at the start for the backlog. And it could lean to the interpretation that the product backlog is full and you just put it into the sprint backlog. In reality, the product owner, the official title, but he does the same as a requirements engineer, works parallel to the engineering team. Requirements has to be gathered, and in my experience, the product owner was always 1 or 2 sprints ahead. So the work is done when the project meets its end. I personally prefer working as a requirements engineer in Agile frameworks because you see more of the project you're gathering requirements for and not leave the team when the action begins. So in short, waterfall, you start with the requirements engineering at the beginning and end and don't see the product itself, and in Scrum, it's occurring parallel. Any questions up until now?
Not a question so far, not on the chat, just a quick hint. Could you move the mic a little bit farther away because you're breathing into it quite heavily? Sorry, thank you.
Better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, then a quick overview of the points we will talk about in the next stations. What's part of requirements engineer? There are different types. You make a stakeholder analysis, a system analysis, a system context analysis, also definitely a requirements analysis. You validate the requirements, prioritize them, and have to document everything. One of the points often forgotten in projects and often underestimated is the stakeholder analysis. Has anyone an idea why it's so important to think about, analyze, and document the stakeholder of a project and not just think? Okay.
I have a thing here. Sorry.
No, just tell.
Late.
No, you can say.
Yeah, because if you don't tell someone he's responsible, or you don't know who's really responsible, often you don't know who's really responsible for the topics we have to do in the project. So if nobody knows what to do and nobody says you what you have to do, no one does anything what's useful for this project.
That's a really good point. And overall, I identified 3 main reasons why I think stakeholder analysis is so important. First, you get an overview about the persons and the topics. When somebody new joins the project, it's an easy way of providing contact data and context of person, because the new person don't know anyone yet. 2, forgetting somebody is always unpleasant. Forgetting a whole department because you never sat down and thought about who could be important can mean a delay or stop of a project. I made 2 experiences in the past. Forgetting the data protection team can mean a big delay of a project, especially when we're talking about data projects, because it has to go on pause when analyzing if the project can be done. They have to identify if the data, process data are allowed to be shown on the report for the department, or if there's anything forbidden to see. And forgetting in Germany, the operation rate meant in one time the cancellation of the project, just for political reasons. Because if you're true, the bigger the project is, the more business politics plays a role. If forgetting someone who can veto against a project is a disaster, it's all about appreciation when including someone early into a project. And the third, talking about business politics, it can also be crucial for preparation, for example, for an interview, to know where a stakeholder stands against the project or as an advocate. It's always good to be prepared and now do an interview with a critic and be overwhelmed of the critics. As a requirements engineer, you are often the first touching point of the stakeholders with the project. You can do a lot of work for the expectation management, so be prepared for everything. Also, system analysis is a big point, and I think that's more clear than its stakeholder analysis. Look at different systems, learn from old system, ask your question, is there an old system you want to replace? Learn everything from the old system, what processes are in, what's the difference in division of the new system to the old system. What are known problems in the old system? What should be thought of? And also, if you have some other systems as a source, learn what systems they are and how they work. When talking about system, the system context is also crucial. It's important to analyze the context. What is the system, or translated, what's in scope of the project? Where do you draw the line between that's important to know and that's in the scope of the project? The context means everything that's important for the system. That can be stakeholders, but also interfaces, other systems, everything that plays a role for the project. And you also have to define where the line is, what you start to ignore, what's not important for the project and are not relevant for you. When we're talking about requirements engineering, as you can imagine, a big part, and I don't think I have to explain why, is the requirements analysis. One key rule there is, when you phrase requirements, it should be unmistakable as possible, so there are no misunderstandings in the interpretations. There are also differences in Scrum and Waterfall how to phrase the requirements. In Scrum, it's more oriented from a perspective. You phrase it, I as a customer, I as a user, I as an administrator. In Waterfall, you talk about the system. The focus is on what the system can do, should do, provide, and so on. But for both methods, you can gather the requirements in the same way. In Waterfall, the requirements also derive from someone's perspective. In Scrum, the programmers will think about this when they are working on the user story, how the system will provide those needs. When gathering requirements, there will be also a point to classify those. One example describes the Kano model shown in this picture. On the x-axis, you see the grade of fulfillment of a requirement. On the y-axis, the satisfaction of the customer. There are three different categorizations: basic needs, performance needs, and delighter. Basic needs describe requirements that are necessary but won't make a user happy. Imagine buying a car, and without wheels, you definitely will be unhappy, but it doesn't make you happy when it has wheels. Performance needs are requirements that you are deliberate of. You want them. When I bought my new car last year, it was for me important that the car had heat seating. I have back pain, so I didn't want a car without seat heating. And today my seat heating makes me really satisfied, but I would be unhappy if it were not there. Delighters describe requirements I'm not aware of. So if they are not fulfilled, I won't be satisfied. I didn't know I wanted. But these are the needs that surprise me the most, and it can't and sometimes after using it, I can't live with them in the future anymore, one time tested. Here, a small example also from buying my car. I never knew I wanted a back camera. It wasn't one of my requirements, but it makes parking a lot easier. And when I have the choice in 10 or 20 years when buying my next car, I think it will also have a back camera. Sometimes requirements can change the classifications over time, but just in one direction. Delighters can change to performance needs and then to basic needs. Do you have an idea what product we definitely all know went through this process, went from delighter to basic need? Nobody? Then
Mobile phone?
Yes, mobile phone, or especially smartphone. Today you wouldn't buy a mobile phone without access to internet and touch. That's a basic need, but when it came out, it was mind-blowing. Documentation is one of the unloved parts of requirements engineering. Maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't met someone who likes to document. But it's a necessary task you can't get around. Especially working with customers in consulting, it's important to document everything, so everyone has the same information. Not just customers and consultants. Every time you work with someone different, a different department when working in-house and so on. Nobody can say that requirements were missing when a document was agreed on. There are different types of documentation when talking about requirements engineering. You can document separate requirements. In waterfall, we call it individual requirements, and when talking about Scrum, that's our user stories. Summarized requirements is the documentation in use cases, or you can use graphical models or interface description. The official documents in requirements engineering are called requirement specification when talking about waterfall, and the product and sprint backlog when talking about Scrum. Also, types of documentations are glossary, prototypes, every note, every scribble you made during your interviews, workshops, brainstorming, or whatever. So, what tools can I use? Some of the things I will show you, they are not only for requirements engineering, but I used most of them, and I think that some of them are really interesting. And yeah, we talked about phrasing unmistakable. You can use a sentence template to do this. Most of the requirements can be phrased the same way, so you don't have to think about how to phrase your requirements if you have a sentence template. Just put it into those templates. They provide that the sentences are short and clear in natural language. Waterfall and Scrum need different types of sentence templates, but just look for one that suits the needs of the project most, or think about a template for yourself. When I'm using this sentence template, one example could be: the system should provide me with the ability to identify the top products the company is selling. That's a way to phrase a sentence template, no, a requirement. I have no picture of a style template because I don't have anything I'm thinking of particular, but use them. A lot of companies already provide style templates. Ask around, use them, make some for yourself. You can also, when you're doing requirements, use your old templates or Excel sheets or anything. If you made your first stakeholder analysis, for example, you have made an Excel with maybe 4 or 5 columns. I don't know what was important for you or for the project. Just reuse it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel again and again and again. The internet is full with style templates. If possible, use those opportunities, use them. It makes just your life easier. In the communication with the customer, also important, graphical models or diagrams. A picture is worth 1,000 words. That comes not from nothing, because it's easier to process and understand for most people a visualized way of processes, data flows, data modeling, and so on. Especially when you're talking a natural language with someone and he provides you with the requirements and you think you understood the processes or how the system is working or should be working, visualize it, show it again to the stakeholder, and he can then give you feedback like, yes, that's what I meant, or the opposite, and specify what's missing. There are also different types of graphical models for which are also official. If there is something that fits your needs, use it, because others, it could be that others know already those graphical notations and understands them better. If there's nothing you find for your need, just draw some lines and pictures and try to visualize. Interviews and questionnaires are a big part of requirements engineering. Communication, as I said, is a big part, and sometimes you have to talk with someone specific and not with a group. But how can you structure such an interview sheet? For my bachelor thesis, I found the SPSS method. I searched for an English name, but didn't find one, so I call it for now the CCSS method, because every letter stands in German for one word. Here for collect, check, sort, and subsume. And it describes a way in 4 steps for creating such an interview sheet. I like the structured approach. It helps me a lot in my everyday work. And I've seen other requirements engineers who just try to make the interview in one step, in one go, and have to review it every time because something was missing, and it was clear that something was missing after talking with. I personally would like to do this together with you, a small interview sheet. So I prepared a little task. We are all a big family with a lot of siblings and want to plan to gift our parents a vacation to their anniversary. But we only have 1 hour to talk with them because we're so busy with work and sessions until their anniversary. So we have to structure beforehand what we want to ask. In the first step, we just brainstorm and collect everything that comes to our mind, every question and topic. It doesn't matter. It's also okay if we write questions down that has nothing to do with vocation. Just writing every little thought we have, we will clear it in the next steps. I would share an Excel sheet. And you can just call it to me or write it in the chat down. So I think maybe 10, maximum 15 questions would be cool. What would you ask if you want to know what the requirements for a vacation are from someone else? My example is, want to drive with car.
Another question could be, do you prefer warm or cold weather?
Good question.
Do you want to cook for yourself or go into all? Yeah.
One other could be, do you like visiting a city or go hiking, for example, or more to the countryside? So city or countryside, maybe?
How long do you want to travel? So how long do you want to drive, and how long should the vacation be? So yeah, 2 questions.
That's okay. I would also, how long do you want to drive? Was this? I would also implement.
Oh, how far?
Want to drive with plane.
Especially if maybe somebody is afraid of going by plane.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Like I
people.
said, it's also completely okay to put something that has nothing to do with anything there. Who is watching the pets, or what do you plan to wear? There's every freedom you have when collecting those questions. Does somebody has something, or then I would go to the next step. Okay, the next step is to check the questions. We just copy because that's the collect step. This is checking. And we want to look at the question if there's anything we don't want to question at all. Something like, I don't think if it's important what they want to wear, and we as a sibling decided that we will watch the pet, so it's not important who watches the pet, and the rest is good as it is. Is the step clear? So we clean just the questions that we in the first step collected. I think it's important to do this way because you're allowing yourself every question and every little thought, but because maybe a little thought can do an association chain to something that's relevant again. So you're not limiting yourself in anything, and watch afterwards what we want to move out. In the next step, when we are sorting the interview, we are already copying the questions. Those two I can delete and try to think what we want to start with. What would be a good first question? What would be a good last question? And if there are any questions similar, I can maybe subsume or summarize later. I think, for example, that's a good start to ask where we want, where the vacation should be, and that's maybe warm or cold weather defines this, and also city or rural area. That's for me one group. because it's a question about where the vacation should be. An idea for the second question?
Yeah, maybe the cook for yourself could be a hint on the kind of accommodation that you want to book. So if it's a hotel or a house or something.
And in my understanding, the four here want to drive with plane or with car, and how long do you want to drive or travel? All is about traveling, so I would copy them into one group as the end. And in the last step, we subsume or summarize these groups, because we don't have to ask just a lot of questions, and we try to give open questions and not closed questions like warm or cold weather, so we can think about a phrase that defines both together. Something like, do you have an idea where the vacation should be? Here, it's like Gabi said, the implication, what type of housing the vacation should start. Is it a hotel, or is it something like an apartment or house, or is it something near a restaurant? So I would ask what type of, where do you want to sleep? And in the last, my example would be, do you have a preferred means of travel? And so we collected some questions and have 3 at the end that are open. We can also ask again or ask deeper if they tell us something. That's also allowed to get deeper into the topics. But we allowed us here our freedom to collect everything and structured our interview in some quick steps, so we are sure that we are not missing something, and have a good order also of the questions. Was this getting clear? Because I would then start with the presentation again.
Yes, I think everybody agrees.
Good. Then we go to the next step. That's about moderation techniques. There are a lot of moderation techniques. You don't have to use it only for requirements gathering. A lot of people complain about inefficient meetings, but when you're responsible of a meeting, you have the power to prepare yourself and also use moderation techniques to improve the effectiveness. This is not only for meetings of a whole day or more, but also you can use them also in a meeting of 1 hour or half an hour if it is useful. Think about them. You find a lot of them. That's not only these that you are seeing here, and therefore the different occasions there. We will talk shortly about most of these techniques because I could talk alone an hour only about moderation technique, maybe more than an hour if I would go deeper. And it's more fun if you have the time and explore and try those moderation techniques. So here the advice: use them, try them. Sometimes they're working good, sometimes not. And with the more you use them, the more you get the feeling when they are good. They are the classic techniques I even heard in school of, like brainstorming and mind mapping. Does anybody need further explanation what these techniques are and how they work? Because in my experience, they are really well known, and they are just here because even though they are known, I see them really rarely. Most of them not because they wouldn't suit the meeting or the workshop, but more because the moderator don't think about those techniques. That's such a no-brainer that you don't have to think about it, something like this. Then there are also the change of perspective. I like it a lot because somebody has to get in the role of another attendee. For example, somebody from the IT tries to understand the point of view of somebody from the accounting. The person then tries to communicate what the person thinks the perspective means. We're talking about requirements, what possible requirements in the accounting could be. The real one from the accounting tries to specify this by contradicting or agreeing. So both have to think about requirements and start to express them, even specifying them. You can also do this with groups. It doesn't have just be one person or two persons. And I like it a lot because it always brings people a bit nearer to each other, because somebody is forced to use the point of view from somebody else and the understanding increase to each other. Also, classics are the single choice question. You focus on a topic or a question for which they have to decide between two options. For example, you can use a question that forces an answer like yes or no, a typical answer of single choice questions. More point questions give the attendees more freedom because you have more than two options, but they have to decide in the end, for example, blue, green, or red. That would be a more point questions answer. If possible, I try to end my workshops with a single or more point question. I look always what's more suitable in the situation to get a feeling what stakeholders are thinking. Was the workshop successful? Is there need for another workshop? Do you think the requirements are complete? And afterwards, you can specify those answers and talk more about them or use it as a discussion point. My favorite to start an interview or a workshop are expectation questions. You ask what the person expects from the meeting or the internet or the interview or the workshop. What does the person hope for happens afterwards? It's one form of expectation management, but there are also a chance of dropping the first requirements between the lines. It can also be helpful not only to talk with the stakeholders, but work with the users, observe them. And there are different ways to do this. First, the diary or journal. The users tries to document what they are doing in their everyday work. As an example, I try to identify which data they request often and how often. If it's not important to get a concrete answer, but just a guess, you can let them answer. But if it's important for the project, let them document it. So you have the realistic overview how often and what data they use. Especially helpful when admitting what data they wanted to analyze but couldn't. These information are informations that are most users forget after 1 or 2 couple of hours. When they write it down and document it to you, you have more the overview how often they wanted to try to analyze something, and if there is something they need more than in the past. If there's time, you can also do a field survey. Sit next or behind the user and watch for yourself what, when, and how often they do what. You get a better feeling of the user and where the focus in their everyday work lies. If there's even more time, you can also use the apprentice technique. You are the apprentice again for the work of the user, and they have to teach you. So you can do partly their work. There, you get the best understanding what they are really doing. But it takes time, and not only your time, but also the time of the users you're learning from. The bigger the project, the further down you should go this list. A small project just needs some notes. But when we're talking about projects that take some years and are worth some millions, apprenticing is the way to go. Okay, now we have our requirements, but without prioritization, the team won't know what to do in which order. It would be bad if they start with something not so important, and at the end, the time is not there for the important parts. So one method is called the Moscow method. There are requirements classified in 4 groups: must, should, could, and won't or would or want. It's a good method, and I worked in a project where it was used successful when working with one department. When a project involves more than one department, I'm no big fan of this method because every department thinks their requirements are the most important. It has a high risk that you just get a lot of must requirement. And the question is, when everything is important, what should we start with? You can also use prioritization matrix, classic with 2 different criteria which you can choose. Here you see value and complexity. Cost is also an often used one. You always put those criteria in relation to each other and see if there's anything which has, in this example, a lot of value but a small complexity. These are requirements easy to implement and to have quick wins. So a good start for everyone. Maybe you should think twice of requirements with a low value and a high complexity. Are they really necessary or could they go out of scope? When I worked with Scrum, this was the way to go to prioritize. Every requirement has a set prioritization, and don't share this with another requirement. One is the most important, there cannot be a second most important. It makes life really easy for the programmers because they really know what to do in which order. There's no more discussion because the prioritization order is clear. And the last one, the $100 test, is a good way to handle requirements from different departments. Everyone gets $100 and can spend them on requirements how they want. One requirement, $100. If it's the only one that's important for you, why not? You can also split it in whatever way you want. You decide how to spend those $100, or the users decide how to spend those $100 and how they want to split it. They have to think which requirement is worth what. In the end, everything will be summed up and you can clearly see the picture through all departments. Maybe some requirements touch 3 different departments, but it's then important not because the requirement itself is so important, because it's important for a lot of departments. Maybe another one is high in value because it's for one department such a big thing. This method is also good if you want to integrate the stakeholders and users more into the prioritization process. Because the last one I talked about, you do it as a requirement engineer with the information you got from the stakeholders, but you make this prioritization. Somebody has to validate them from the customer side. Here, the customer itself make those prioritization, the users itself. So it's a good way to integrate them. Okay, We have all requirements. We have written down the prioritization. Now we have to check if everything is valid and if my job is done. My job is done when the requirements are complete. Every single one has to be complete, but also the mass of requirements. If they are trackable, correct, consistent, testable, and necessary. In best case, someone that is not you as the requirement engineer, check and validate if the requirements are representing the needs. And there are different ways to do this. You can build a prototype. The stakeholder can then react and specify if something is missing or give positive feedback if it's meeting their vision. In Agile project, the minimum viable product is used. In specific sprints, the stakeholder can test and see how far the engineering has gone and give them feedback if the project is in the right track or not. But we can also work with the documentation we have, especially in waterfall with the requirement specification. A walkthrough describes a workshop with the goal to review all requirements written down. The author is also an attendee to answer questions, but mostly other persons that are the reviewers are reading through the requirements and look if there are any quality issues or open questions. The whole meeting is then protocoled, so the requirements engineer can afterwards update the requirement specification. And you do this until there are no open points and no quality issues again. Okay, I talked a lot about requirements engineering in general, but this session is called for data projects. So I want to talk a bit about the peculiarities of data project. This is a quote from Andrew Hunt and David Thomas that speaks to me from my soul. And I think it's more true for data projects than for software. Don't gather requirements, dig them. But why? Data are more abstract than processes for most people. When you implement software, you implement and automate processes, most of the time already existing processes. It's also easier to speak about the expected behavior of software. When I click on this button, I want that the film font is archived in database. Mandatory fields are the user should log in with the email and the password and so on. These are things they can say. It's easy for them to talk about this. When talking about data, requirements lie even deeper under the surface because the user have often no imagination what's possible in both ways. I experienced a customer that wanted a report that the data couldn't give. It was a big requirement for them, an important requirement, to analyze their top products, but nowhere in the data were sales numbers. And it wasn't easy and needed a lot of discussion again and again and again because they wanted it so much and couldn't understand why it shouldn't be. They had no idea that their own data, what their own database looked like. In software engineering, almost everything is possible. In worse, the costs explode. In data projects, not everything is possible. And I also had the customer in the other way that had a gold mine in their database, but didn't use it because there was no idea what they can do with. The problem goes even further. In software engineering, it's not uncommon to have a requirements engineer with just a basic understanding of programming. It's not necessary to have a deeper understanding. It's good, but it's not necessary. It's also easier for a requirements engineer to understand where the problems are when talking about processes. But when talking about data project, it can be crucial to have experience with data when gathering requirements. It's not only to understand the business. It's not your job to only understand the business and to talk with them, but also to gather and talk with the team to identify delighters. What can the databases make possible? You can't answer this with no experience in such a project. It's even worse when talking about machine learning project because you don't know at the start what to expect at the end. And when you don't think that data engineering is your thing, but you want to work in this context as a requirements engineer or project manager, they also often do the task of requirements analysis. Make your life easier and learn something about data and data projects from your colleagues, with your own experience, with the help of sessions or training. Do it, it's totally worth it. I myself worked in the past as a requirement engineer and also as an engineer. I think that's a big advantage compared to colleagues without the data background I worked with. It doesn't mean that the customer have to be unhappy when the requirement engineer has no data experience, but you lose a lot of opportunities. It's also harder to understand which requirements are possible and which not. I wanted to say something in the end and not just start not talking, but my headset was gone off. Sorry for this.
It was an amazing mic drop opportunity. So
yeah, so we got to the end of my session. There are time for any questions that are open, and I don't know if there's any possibility to share my presentation. I have no problems. Ask then in via email. I also have some interesting links I worked with. Game storming is especially interesting when you try to learn something about moderation techniques. There are a lot of funny games. Okay.
So then, first of all, before we start the question round, already a big thanks. That was a great session, in my opinion. Yeah, before we start the Q&A, I will paste the link for the session feedback just now in the chat, and would like to remind you, please give feedback on the sessions. It's really useful. It's useful for everybody. Just let me remind you. And now, please, any questions there weren't any on the chat.
I think the most parts of the presentation were basic, so it's no wonder when there are not any questions, but it's okay if you have anything, and if you don't dare now, just reach me out private or something. I will also react to that.
And also, Margarita, first of all, thank you very much. And if you send me your slides, I'm more than happy to put them on our GitHub, and we will link to that also in combination with the recordings, which will go online next week.
Yeah, I will do this.
Awesome.